Well, thank you, Bill, for that impressive refutation. But I do have to tell you, if you think I'm going to change my mind because you have a mathematical proof for the existence of God, I'm sorry, but it ain't going to happen. Well, okay, so I'm sorry I have only 12 minutes for refutation. I need about 3 hours, as I imagine Bill does, too. Let me say again that I respect Bill's personal belief that Jesus was raised from the dead, but I find that his claim that this can be historically proven to be dead wrong. I'm going to break my response down into 4 dubious aspects of Bill's presentation, giving examples instead of trying to be exhaustive and covering the waterfront. First, Bill makes dubious use of modern authorities. Bill constantly quotes modern scholars as if somehow that constitutes evidence for his point of view. As Bill himself knows, the fact that the majority of New Testament scholars would agree with his 4 points is not proof that they are right. For one thing, the majority of New Testament scholars are believers in the New Testament. That is, they're theologically committed to the text. So of course they agree on these points. I should note that the majority of historians do not agree with Bill's conclusions. Does that make those conclusions wrong? No, it simply means that his conclusions are not persuasive to most historians. Having said that, I'm surprised by some of the so-called authorities that Bill cites. For the reality is that the majority of critical scholars studying the historical Jesus today disagree with his conclusion that a historian can show that the body of Jesus emerged physically from the tomb. Bill might find that surprising, but that would be because of the context he works in, a conservative evangelical seminary. In that environment, what he's propounding is what everyone believes. But it's striking that even some of his own key authorities don't agree. He quotes a number of scholars whom I consider to be friends and acquaintances, and I can tell you, they don't agree with his views. Does that make him wrong? No, it simply means that his impressive recounting of scholarly opinion is slanted, lopsided, and fails to tell the real story, which is that he represents a minority opinion. Second, Bill makes dubious use of ancient sources. Bill quotes the Apostle Paul, just to pick an example, to indicate that already just 5 years after Jesus' death, Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus. Paul wasn't writing 5 years after the burial. He was writing 25 years later, and he never mentions Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea is not mentioned until you get to the Gospel of Mark, 35 or 40 years after the fact. When Paul indicates that Jesus was buried, he may just as well have meant that he was buried in a communal grave, which is far more frequently happened with crucified criminals. Paul said he got buried. He may simply have been tossed into a communal grave. I should point out that in some of Bill's writings, he's quoted a lot of my writings in ways that I don't... He's taking things out of context, as I'll show in a few minutes, because what he's saying I've changed my mind to, I don't agree with. But in his own writings, he indicates that Mark has a sparse narrative of Jesus being buried, and since it's an unembellished narrative, as he calls it, it's more likely then to be historical. I want to know if he still thinks that an unembellished tradition is more likely to be historical. Because if that is true, then I want him to tell us whether he thinks that Matthew's more embellished tradition is unhistorical. This is comparable to his comment a few minutes ago that the earliest traditions all agree on something, so we don't have to worry about the later ones. Well, then tell us. Do you think that the later ones are unhistorical? Third, Bill makes dubious claims and assertions. For example, Bill asserts that the story of the women going to the tomb would never have been invented by the early Christians. I should point out, Paul never mentions the women at the tomb, only the later Gospels, Mark and following. But here the problem is one that's typical of much of Bill's position. His claim does not take seriously the nature of our sources. Anyone intimate with Mark's Gospel would have no difficulty at all seeing why, 35 years after the event, he or someone in his community might have invented the story. Mark's Gospel is filled with theological reflections on the meaning of the life of Jesus. This is Mark's Gospel. It's not a data sheet It's a gospel. It's a proclamation of the good news as Mark saw it, of Christ's death and resurrection. One of Mark's overarching themes is that virtually no one during the ministry of Jesus could understand who he was. His family didn't understand. His townspeople didn't understand. The leaders of his own people didn't understand. Not even the disciples understood in Mark. Especially not the disciples. For Mark, only outsiders have an inkling of who Jesus was. The unnamed woman who anointed him. The centurion at the cross. Who understands at the end? Not the family of Jesus. Not the disciples. It's a group of previously unknown women. The women at the tomb fit in perfectly with Mark's literary purposes otherwise, so they can't simply be taken as some kind of objective historical statement of fact. They too neatly fit the literary agenda of the gospel. The same can be said of Joseph of Arimathea. Anyone who cannot think why Christians might invent the idea that Jesus had a secret follower among the Jewish leaders is simply lacking in historical imagination.